So starting on the left, we have Jeff Butler, the creative director of EverQuest next. Darren McPherson, our lead designer. Steve Denuzer, a senior designer. And Ryan Barker, also a senior designer, our lore lead.
What you're looking at right now is a timeline of 20,000 years of recorded history on Norath. It's broken up into 4 eras and a bunch of different ages inside those eras. The eras are named for sort of the overriding society that had the most influence on Norath during that time. So you start with the Keldorain, then there's a Lost era, and the Dahl era, and the Combine era. What we're going to specifically talk about today is the Dahl era, which we'll get into in a second. And then the ages are divided up by a very specific event that happened that really changed the culture in some way, but didn't necessarily destroy the whole society or anything like that. They're still in charge, but something happened that changed it in a fundamental way. So we'll get into the Dahl era. So those of you that played EQ1 and EQ2 will recognize the word Dahl, or at least the syllable, I suppose. There's several different types of Dahl in the previous games: Quetta Dahl, Fair Dahl, Tyr Dahl. And once again, we're using it the same way. It's basically another word for elf. And there's different types of elves. So the Dahl era covered 2,000 years of elven dominance across Norath. They were clearly far and away the most powerful force in society on the world. And it began with the Age of Ascension. Before the Age of Ascension in the Lost era, it was a really dark time. There was a lot of evil creatures about. There wasn't much society to speak of. The elves mostly lived in small villages and whatnot, and they didn't really have control of their environment. They were really just fighting to survive. The Age of Ascension is where all that changed, and they started founding cities, having technology, and being able to defend their lands and form kingdoms and eventually empires and whatnot. So right after the Age of Ascension covers all that time right up until the elves figured out how to use went too far. Use the spires you guys are used to seeing in the wizard spires. That's actually the big shift for the elves in that era was when they figured out how to use those things to travel vast distances. So this opened up all kinds of opportunities for exploration, where they started to run into different races and different realms and regions and planes and whatnot. And this is where that's why it's called the Age of Allies, is where they started to form these bonds between the different societies and sort of build up an actual interracial society, I guess would be a good term for it.
And it's worth calling out that, again, because you have to, even though there's a lot of familiar things in here, don't assume that they're handled the same way in our storyline as previous games. So the spires that you're used to seeing may look like the regular wizard teleport spires that you're used to from previous games, but ours can actually not just take you to certain places on Norath, but to realms beyond Norath as well.
Like I mentioned, the alliances started forming between the different races and whatnot. And the elves even befriended the dragons in some form. This is a pretty big event because the dragons really brought a lot of magical knowledge to the elves, and it signaled a big change in the speed at which the society developed. The dragons were able to help them with a lot of magical knowledge and whatnot as they progressed. So this was really a golden age for all involved. Like, this was sort of the golden age of Norath, if you will, where everyone was mostly friendly. There were occasional squabbles or wars with aggressive creatures and whatnot. But for the most part, this was sort of the advancement age, where everyone was fairly happy and moving in the right direction. But as with all good things, it of course had to come to an end with your old friends, the Shissar, showed up and decided to ruin the party. So they first appeared friendly. The elves had, of course, had alliances and friends with all these other races, and this just seemed like another one that was going to be friendly. And I'm not sure what the elves were doing, trusting a snake, but they ended up betraying the elves. They were basically just biding their time for the perfect moment to betray them. So in the middle of another war that they had helped trigger, they actually betrayed the elves and attacked them and almost conquered Norath. They laid waste to several elven cities. It really looked dire, and the only reason the elves really came out of that was because of all the other previous alliances they had made with the other races. So the combined forces of the elves and the other races, small c, combine, turned the Shissar back and sealed the spires that led to the Shissar worlds.
I think it may have happened, Ryan, because the snakes have very expressive faces. And they were probably smiling.
Because they read from a distance. And
Yes.
You can see
Do
that.
They were
snakes ever
visible from a
not
distance.
smile?
They were very, very, very emotional.
All right. We'll write that in. This was a change in age here too. Right after the Shisar War, this is when the Takish Age happened, and most of you will recognize the name Takishiz from previous games, and that was their capital city. The Takish Age was a big shift because the elves became paranoid that could happen again. Maybe one of the other races was just biding time and waiting for them to be exposed and bring down their society. So they started. A lot of racial tension started to divide the empire. All the alliances they had became very strained. The elves sort of started to feel themselves superior, and that was really embodied in the Quetzal movement. The Quetzal started out as sort of it actually started out as a really positive force of sort of highborn elves, the best of society, if you will. War heroes and whatnot were considered Quetzal, kings and dukes and things like that. But eventually, it sort of turned into, a bad thing where they sort of felt themselves superior to everyone else and really started subjugating all the other races. And the only reason,
Well, no, and again, this is one of those things where just because you're familiar with the term doesn't mean we're treating it the same way. So in previous games, Quetzal, Feardal, Teardal were different races, different subspecies of elves, and really in our game, the Quetzal is more like a social sect of elves. So there's kind of more like one elven race, and it turns out through the storyline, you'll kind of figure out how those subdivide and what that really means for those other names.
So the only reason this really worked for the elves is they had a unique form of magic that was sort of like a nuclear deterrent. Basically, they held all the magic cards and were able to not.
They're really good at playing magic.
Really good at mana. But yeah, so they had this higher form of magic that even the dragons were afraid of, and so that really allowed them to sort of have this vast empire and form the Takish Empire that imposed all this oppressive regime over all the other races. And terrible oppression. And this is a point where the dragons really they didn't like this at all. And even though the elves had high magic, it wouldn't let them have sort of the level of control over actual dragons that they did over other races. But there are lots of other draconic races that were allied with the dragons that they totally could subjugate. So like the kobolds is a really good example, like drakes and wyverns and things like that. All fell into this oppression as well. And this is when the dragons became isolated and went back up to Velius and basically didn't have anything to do with the rest of the Elven Empire or the other races for a really long time. All right. So the Takish Empire probably would have stood for hundreds and hundreds, well, it did stand for hundreds and hundreds of years, but it would have stood for hundreds more had it not been for the Sundering. And the Sundering was destroyed the capital of Takishiz, and the elves aren't exactly sure what caused it, but one of the teleportation spires exploded and basically covered the entire capital in miles and miles of rock. So there's a giant ruined city under this huge mountain where their capital used to be. High magic stopped working for some reason related to this as well. So the empire really fell into decay, and it triggered a lot of different civil wars where the previous kingdoms started fighting against each other and vying for power and whatnot. Eventually, they were all put down, and a sort of strained peace set in where a shadow of the old empire existed, and they were able to keep the peace and whatnot, but it definitely wasn't anywhere near the power level that they had before.
It's worth mentioning, too, so the Sundering happens, and as Ryan said, Takish is buried underneath all these miles and miles of rock, and there's devastation and destruction. What's atop that now is the Ashfang, which is that new area that you saw in the presentation. So again, all that story is layered in there, and there's reasons for why that's there and why Ashfang looks the way that it does.
And to those of you, before you go on, to those of you who keep track of lore, and I know that there are a lot of you because we love you, and you've been at it for 14 plus years. One point, the word, the Sundering, is probably going to actually change in our storyline. We'll probably call it something else. Just something that I wanted to let you know. It's probably not
A very large party.
the Sundering or the Cataclysm.
Anyway, so like Ryan mentioned, as part of the evolution of the Takish Empire, they got so full of themselves, so convinced that their way was right, that they even started subjugating some of the draconic races. So when the Sundering happens and high magic gets broken, the dragons don't have to be wary of the elves anymore, and now they kind of got a grudge to settle against the elves. So they really lashed out in a big way, and their army started moving, and they swept into Fade, where the elves had vast settlements and throughout that continent, and the dragons just rolled through and started devastating cities, killing countless people. The last remnants of the Takish Empire, was kind of stragglers left behind. That got wiped away by the dragon's aggression kind of moving through the world. The positive thing that happened out of this was that a new alliance formed. And so, we had the Coatadal, who were the kind of, elven purists. There was another faction of elves within their society that was open and welcoming of other races, and those were the Fyrdal. And so the Fyrdal joined together with some of the races that the Takish had formerly oppressed, like the ogres, like the dwarves, the Karens, and they came together to form this alliance of equals. And so the Combine kind of had some momentum and started striking back against the dragons, but it ushered in this very long and costly war. And unfortunately, no matter how good their spirit was or how fiercely they were fighting for their homelands, the forces of the dragons were just too powerful. Picture just death and devastation on an incredible scale. And so the Combine forces realized that they couldn't stay in their homelands anymore. They had to flee somewhere else. So to buy time for this, they decided that they had to make this one final stand. And this last stand happens at the fortress called Bastion, which is this great story that you'll be able to read. And it tells the tale of this one last group of elves, this group of their best soldiers led by Karamor Thex, and that is the Tyrdal. So the Tyrdal in our game are this elite force of elves. And Karamor and his forces are going to distract the dragons, keep them at bay, while at Bastion, the last stragglers, the last remnants of the Combine Accord can board ships and sail away. And their plan is that they're going to go to Kunark, because Kunark at this time is pretty much a wild frontier. And there's been some settlements there over time, but nothing huge. And at least the Combine know that the dragons aren't there, so they feel like they can get away, hopefully set up shop in Kunark and rebuild and kind of hopefully one day make a stand again. So now we start moving beyond the Dahl era into the next era of history, which is the Combine era, when the Combine are the dominant force on Norath. The beginning of the Combine era is this age of exile. The stand at Bastion is successful. The cost is very high, but the Combine...
Spoilers.
Yeah, sorry. The details really come alive in the story, so you're going to want to read it anyway. But thankfully, some amount of the Combine is able to get away and sail to Kunark. So awesome. The dragons are left behind. This looks like things are going to be okay. And so they're going to be spending some time on Kunark. But what they don't realize is that there's an old enemy waiting for them. The Shisar are on Kunark, and they've been preparing another attack against the Combine forces. And it's like the Combine just sail right into their waiting arms. And the Shisar are like, oh yeah. And the Shisar have a new alliance now. They have a race of soldiers that they've bred and they're totally mind controlling. And those are the Ixar. So between these, let me go back. I'll get to that. You know that's coming. So this really leads to like 500 years of captivity, and the Combine are completely subjugated by the Shisar and their Ixar soldiers. And this is a very dark time. Like the Combine are really down. It was their last stragglers. They've got no high magic. It's really desperate. They're completely subjugated. There's no freedom amongst their people.
Nobody knows.
Oh yeah, this is where the blues comes from on Norath. It's that kind of time, and but thankfully something happens, which we'll reveal details of in future stories. But the Ixar start an uprising, And the Combine kind of feed into this because these Ixar want to be free, and the Combine want to be free of the Shisar rule as well. So the Combine join in on this. They're able to overthrow the Shisar and once again drive them back to their own world and seal the portal behind them. So things sound like they're going well again. Now the Combine is there. They're able to rebuild a little bit. The Ixar are starting to build their own society, but the Ixar are a little broken. They've been completely subjugated. And so there's a big portion of their society that now that they're free, they can't help kind of adopting some of the old ways of their masters. And they start thinking, well, these Combine have a lot of old knowledge that we don't have. And it's very useful to keep them around. And so one of the characters that rises to prominence in the Ixar society, a guy named Venerable Sather, decides that he really wants to keep these guys here. And the Combine don't want to be subjugated again. They don't want to be under the thumb of just this other empire. And there's factions within the Ixar that are sympathetic with the Combine. And so, once again, it's time to leave. And now they've got to go back and retake their homeland. So this begins the next age, which is the Age of Heroes, which is the time when EverQuest Next begins. So imagine this setting. You've got all these different races. You've got the elves, you've got the dwarves, you've got ogres, their allies there, and they've been subjugated for a long time. Their society's been decimated. They're holding on to fragments of history because that's all that they have anymore. And they've made the decision to leave the land that they know, that their current generations have grown up in, to go to a place that their forefathers talked about, to return to this land. But they don't know what they're going to face. Like, there was a huge war there, and all their old civilization was wiped out. Are the dragons still there? Are they just going into yet another trap? What's going to happen? So the Combine sails back, and now they have to make a new foothold in what amounts to an unexplored frontier. They don't know what they're going to face anymore. So they found a new city. They found the city of Kinos, and that's going to be their foothold in this land. But things have changed over this 500 years that they've been gone. And there's new political forces that have arisen in the world and new enemies to face in this land. And there's a lot of questions that they have to answer. Like, what's going to happen to this society? Who are they going to be encounter? Who are they struggling against for resources? Because they've come with nothing. They've got like the clothes on their backs and a few ships and some supplies. But they've got to very quickly get resources from this land. And so picture the Kinos that you'll encounter at the start of the game is really this ragged frontier town. It's the Mos Eisley of Norath, because there's a lot of people, that there's people who are doing good and struggling and who want to build new lives, and there's some people who are coming in who want to take advantage of that. So how this city evolves and how it grows over time, that's where you guys come in, because you are the ones who get to tell the next chapter in the story. And so when you encounter that Kinos at the beginning, that is this rough and tumble frontier town, you are the ones who are going to have to help that become a great city, to become the jewel in Norath's crown, and to see if the Combine Accord can become a force for good in this world and establish themselves once again, or if they're just going to encounter new enemies here that they struggle against and that could strike them down. So that's kind of the history that we're talking about right now. And we've got a couple other subjects that we're still going to go into. Okay. So a couple other things that tie into the lore. Certainly religion and the gods is one of the things that defines the EverQuest franchise. And we're doing a little different take on religion in this version of Norath. So what we wanted philosophically was for the gods to be tangible influences in the lives of Norathians. These are forces that they believe in, that they care about, that drive them, that are embedded in many of the political organizations in the world. But what we didn't want is for these gods to just be standing around being raid targets, that you break into their plane and you attack them and you get big bags of loot like it doesn't matter. So as of at the start of the game, while there's people who believe, most people believe in some form of religion, which I'll go into in a second, but nobody who's living on Norath at the time has seen any of the gods. So it's just something that they believe in. Again, very tangible forces in their lives. And there's stories about things that the gods have done in history, but nobody alive has seen one. And whether they will or not, that's to be discovered. So there's kind of, we focused on 4 separate belief systems because we kind of wanted to narrow things down and kind of tie these up into kind of bundles that fit certain cultural styles. So of these 4 main religions, there's the Seraphs, there's the Four, and then there's worship of Vishan, and something called the Norai. So I'll go into details on this. The Seraphs are gods that, a lot of which you'll be familiar with the names of these gods. So this is the religion that's worshipped by the Combine, principally. It's seen as a newer, more sophisticated kind of religion. And it focuses on 8 figures that kind of bundle up and define a lot of characteristics. They each have kind of roles in the world. And while you'll be familiar with the names, and we've deliberately worked in the nostalgia factor to tie in a lot of what you know about them already into these gods, we've also added a lot of new stuff and taken some influences from other gods and kind of combined them together. Again, it's our fresh take on this, and we wanted to have these very clear and distinct roles for each of the gods. So this, I'll show you some of the symbols here, and we're going to get to our hat giveaway as part of this, so pay attention. But so this symbol is kind of a combined god of Luclin and Dranal. And this is a goddesses of prophecy and also the past. This is an example of a new deity that we've injected into the system. This is a god called Talon. This is Anashti, who's the Reaper. Will be familiar from EverQuest too. Salusek is a god of fire, but also a god of learning, a god of arcane study. Erelisi, who is not only a goddess of love in its various forms, but also a goddess of nature, of growth. Nathaniel, who's the champion, he's the warrior. He's a figurehead of war in its various forms, but also of honor and duty. Brel, who is the builder. Everyone who crafts things, everyone who builds things, they revere him. And so, this is one last symbol, and can anyone guess what god this would be? I think you had your hand up first there. Karana, very good. Karana is the traveler. So he embodies the things from Norath past, which is the kind of storm aspect, but we've kind of modified that a little bit because storms affect traveling. So he's the god who oversees anyone who's got to make journeys, things like that. The Four is a more archaic kind of religion. It's seen as somewhat more primitive, and the civilization, the Keldarane, that preceded the Dahl are the ones who originated this form.
Wrap it up.
Yeah. So there is Prexus, the god of water. There is Amaryl, the goddess of earth. There is Ignestus, the god of fire, and Ansha, who is the goddess of air. And again, the people of Hollis kind of worship this group. Then there's Vishan, whom, of course, the dragons worship, but there's also some mortals who worship her, but it's more of a fringe thing. And then there's the Norai, which is kind of the world spirit of Norath, which the Karen believe in, and they see this as the influence that guides their lives.